We are on Hawaiian time, but I think it is time to start. Good evening, aloha, good to see everyone. I know we exhausted you all day with all the panels and all the talks, but hey, we're philosophers. We can take a lot, right? I'm sure many people are looking for this place. We don't often have events in the School of Architecture, but since this is a very special event, this is going to be a keynote addressing us, we really wanted to have this auditorium. I think you'll agree it's a little bit more fancy than the one in the art building. The people who know me will also know that I have always been a proponent of getting the original voice. It's one thing to have a fine expert, let's say on African or African American studies, and it's a very different thing to have someone who is actually from Africa or actually African American. It doesn't mean that these two types of scholars are not compatible, not at all. I happen to be a scholar of Islamic philosophy. I travel a lot in the Islamic world, and I always appreciated that my Muslim colleagues love to have the non-Muslim voice. You need to have both, and this is very important, in particular for the East-West Philosophers Conference. That's how we started, 1939. Right? We got people from Japan, from China, in time, from India, and many more places in the world. So all of this to kind of like introduce Quayson, an extraordinary scholar, definitely a voice of Africa. He is a native of Ghana, where he earned a BA in English and Arabic. I didn't know about the Arabic. We only found out about it today. So that got me very excited, of course, or got me additionally excited. Then he got his PhD from Cambridge University. After that, he's lectured pretty much everywhere. It's insane. I'll just mention some places: Singapore, Hong Kong, Turkey, Australia, Israel, definitely many, many countries in Africa, in Europe, and of course in the United States. Now, he has a very special title. It's the kind of title where you really need to pay attention to your notes. Now, just listen to me. Quayson, not Ajo, he corrected me on the first day. Quayson is the Jean G. and Maurice M. Doyle Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies. He is also Professor of Comparative Literature, the Chair of English and of African and African American Studies. That's a lot of expertise. And we really feel extremely proud that he was able to come. I don't think we can take it for granted that Professor Quayson was able to make time for us. Otto's most recent book is Tragedy and Post-Colonialism in Literature, in which he taps into Greek thought. I think we got a sense today, after his intervention, that Greek philosophy, Aristotle, was definitely a very familiar field to him. He also then went to Shakespeare, of course, and then reached into the contemporary world. It is time that we give him a hand and welcome him to the podium. Thank you for coming.
My talk today will center primarily on two of Toni Morrison's female characters, namely Consolata in Paradise and Baby Sharks in Beloved. Each of these women illustrates a particular combination of ethics, spirituality, and healing, while also coping with various senses of loss. But the overall point I want to put forward in my talk is that Toni Morrison makes it impossible for us to reach insecure resolution without constantly anticipating its alternatives. This is achieved through her experiments with varying modes of narration, such that she induces an active form of reader participation in assembling the meanings that might be derived from the novels, while also generating a simultaneous dialectic of doubt and anticipation on the part of the reader. The overall effect is that we find ourselves contemplating counter-narratives to hegemony in our reading that also educate us in how to make sense of our own lived world and also deepen our ethical standpoints. A key aspect of Beloved and Paradise, as well as Jazz, Song of Solomon, The Mercy, and Home, is the ways in which Morrison incorporates different forms of spatial traversal in the novels that are tied to the geographies of selfhood of a female character. The term spatial traversal implies several interrelated elements. First is the very banal fact that one's relationship to space is quite different when walking, or riding a horse, or a bicycle, or in a car, or on a train. Each means of locomotion imposes a different relationship to the spatial environment one traverses. What is more important in the representation of the means of locomotion in spatial traversal, in literature and in film, however, is the degree to which the character either A, demonstrates awareness of what is taking place in the immediate vicinity of traversal, B, consciously interacts with the social and natural environment in the process of spatial traversal, and C, is affected by stimuli from the external environment that trigger emotional processes and responses inside of their own consciousness. Even though these three are not mutually exclusive, it is not uncommon for them to be represented separately. The zero sum of spatial traversal is typically where none of the aforementioned features is evident, and the objective of the representation is merely to show that the character has been transported from point A to point B. In this case, both the means of locomotion and the spatial traversal are simply used as the convenient conduits for changing the location of the narrative. We shall not be paying any attention to this zero-sum vector of spatial traversal, except to bear it in mind as a contrast to the other types. Additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, the change in geographical or spatial location is not devoid of ethical significance. When the character shifts locations, it is often to demarcate a shift in the ethical character of the different locations themselves. This shift in the ethical character of different spatial locations is most evident in works where there's also an implication of stark environmental, racial, or class differences between the locations. As a general rule, such characteristics impose a challenge to the character's ethical sensibility and what choices they might make within the different venues. Thus, for example, Dante's Divine Comedy is structured entirely as a journey through different ethically charged spatial locations. And in diasporic literature, the ethical contrast between spatial locations is even more dramatic, such that in texts as varied as Eva Hoffman's Lost in Translation, Amy Tan's The Joyla Club, Mbolo Mbue's Behold the Dreamers, or even in Steven Spielberg's children's film Fievel Goes West, the shift from the homeland to the country of sojourn poses fundamental existential challenges to the biographical integrity of the diasporic individual. Morrison's novels illustrate different forms of spatial traversal and their assimilation into the consciousness of her characters. Her novel Paradise, for example, is literally festooned with the pathways and journeys across America that the different girls that come to reside in the convent undertake to arrive there. The convent was originally a school for training destitute indigenous children to become Catholic nuns. But by the start of the novel, it has fallen into hard times with the lengthy illness and subsequent death of Mary Magna, their Mother Superior, throwing the entire convent into disarray. In her final days, Mary Magna is cared for by Consolata, also called Connie in the novel, and of whom we shall have more to say presently. The other women we encounter at the convent, such as Pallas, also called Mavis, Gigi, also called Grace, and Seneca, all arrived there in what appear to be completely serendipitous journeys that crisscross America. The women have escaped variants of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and the overall challenge to their articulation of freedom as women. But the important thing to note is that they each bear the traces of the places they have left behind, as well as aspects of the geographies they have traversed to get to the convent. Their identities are shaped in a form of oscillation in which their present conditions of free expression as they live at the convent are persistently interrupted and reshaped by their geographical experiences of different spaces. The residues of spatial traversals lodged in the consciousness of the different female characters will become central to the shamanic seance of collective dreaming they participate in under the tutelage of Consolata near the end of the novel, as we shall see presently. As readers of Morrison's novels will know, she often places at their narrative and symbolic center examples of women-only households. Perhaps the most well-known is the woman-only household of 124 Bluestone Road in Beloved. But in fact, there are other such powerful households scattered throughout her oeuvre, such as those of the 3 colorful sex workers in The Bluest Eye, the one ruled over by the one-legged EWPC in Sula, Pilate in Song of Solomon, and of course Consolata in Paradise. These women-only households become the sources of what I refer to in my title as the ethnography of the private sphere, that entails both caregiving as well as the processes of radical self-creation. At the simplest level, the ethnography of the private sphere may be seen in contrast to that of the stipulations of the agora. The significance of the contrast between the two came to me in my long years of teaching African and post-colonial literature. It is noticeable, for example, that Chinua Achebe's most widely read Things Fall Apart is entirely dominated by the decisions and actions of men. These take place either through public debating forums, such as the ILO or marketplace, or in Okonkwo's meal hut inside of his circular household. In Achebe's novel, we find many examples of men talking to men about war, crime and punishment, the taking of titles and marriage, the cultural changes taking place in their own society and those of neighboring communities, and the significance of the arrival of the Christians and the colonial authorities, among other things. It is a novel firmly of the agora, and the tragedy of both Okonkwo and of Umofia unfold in the spatio-temporal rhythms set by it. A contrast to this public sphere type of narrative in African literature is provided by Zimbabwean Titi Dandarenga's Nervous Conditions, where there are many painstaking descriptions of cooking, the vulnerabilities of motherhood, and the vagaries of family life, that are all tied specifically to the actions of the women in the novel. Significantly, even though Nemo's Conditions is set during the historical period of the Chimurenga, Zimbabwe's guerrilla war of independence that raged in the 1960s and 70s, unlike other novels set in the same period, it makes absolutely no reference to the war at all. The sphere of privacy in Nemo's Conditions is also the sphere of a tremulous female interiority, shaped through the interactions of the women with the insistent demands of backbreaking rural agrarian labor, the Western educational system, and the brutal demands of an intractable patriarchy. The title of the novel thus refers to the fact that the space for attaining a working definition of womanhood is itself akin to the domain of war, and that it is the private sphere that incubates the nervous conditions of identity formation under hegemony and duress. Nervous conditions provides a magnificent contrast to Things Fall Apart and allows us to see the forcefulness of the ethnography of the private sphere. The focus on women-only households in Morrison's novels also allows us to see in great detail the progressive shaping of the ethnography of the private sphere, as well as the challenges to self-creation that are deeply entangled with this ethnography. But unlike what we see in Dangaremba's novel, and indeed in many novels of the African-American tradition, such as Alice Walker's The Color Purple or Zora Neale Hurston's The Eyes of Watching God, Morrison also uses the ethnography of the private sphere to center powerfully shamanic female figures that instigate the process of self-creation in those who don't ever do that again. But his eyes, first startled, then revolted, had said the rest of what she should have known right away. Clover, cinnamon, soft old linen. Who would chance pears and a wall of prisoner wine with the woman bent on eating him like a meal? Consolata is completely distraught. Her mistaking of amorous love for divine love, and her attempt to ingest her lover as though he were a sacrament is fairly obvious from the context. What is not so obvious is the sense of extraordinary guilt that gets lodged in her psyche after this momentous incident. As we see further, Consolata virtually crawled back to the chapel, wishing fervently that he could be there. And of course, there's an ambiguity about he. Which he is this? Glowing red in the dim light. Dear Lord, I didn't want to eat him. I just wanted to go home. Mary Magdalene came into the chapel and, kneeling with her, put an arm around Consolata's shoulder, saying, "At last." "You don't know," said Consolata. "I don't need to know, child. But he, she wanted to say, meaning, he and I are the same. Said Mary Magdalene. Never speak of him again. She might not have agreed so quickly, but as Mary Magdalene led her out of the chapel into the schoolroom, a sunshot seared her right eye, announcing the beginning of a bad vision, and she began to see best in the dark. Consolata had been spoken to. By the way, the sha appears also in Beloved. When Seti first sees the school teacher inventorizing the animal parts of the animal parts from the human parts, it's by accident. She sees them through the window, and she feels something like bird beaks poking at her skull, and the sha feeling. It appears also in Sula. Or is it the bluest? I think it's one of them. So I digress. A consolated bad vision is an inauguration of a blindness that nevertheless also accentuates her other senses. Later on, she's prevailed upon by another female healer from Ruby called Lone to use her powers to step into the consciousness of dying people and to bring them back to life. This stepping in is something that Consolata feels is anathema to her religious sensibilities, and she deploys it in desperation to try and birth Mary Magna back to life when the older woman is seriously ill. But with this operation, Consolata comes to compound the earlier guilt she experiences for having wanted to ingest deacon. In both instances, a supreme act of utterly selfless love is experienced by her as a form of contamination, and she lives the rest of her life in a futile quest for divine absolution. All the while, she's surrounded by the bickering, fighting, complaining, and altogether insufferable young women who reside with her at the convent. At last, Consolata snaps. She imperiously commands the girls to be quiet and to listen to her carefully. They are all to strip completely naked and to find a position to lie on the cold stone floor of the cellar. They are each then to draw the silhouette of their prostration and to lie inside their chosen template, completely silent and immobile. The entire place is also ringed with candles. And this is what we see. Gradually, they lost the days. That is how the loud dreaming began, how the stories rose in that place. Half tales and the never dreamed escaped from their lips to soar high above guttering candles, shifting dust from crates and bottles. And it was never important to know who said the dream or whether it had meaning. In spite of it, or because of their body's ache, they stepped easily into the dreamer's state. In loud dreaming, monologue is no different from a freak. Accusations directed to the dead and long gone are undone by murmurs of love. So, exhausted and enraged, they rise and go to their beds, vowing never to submit to that again, but knowing full well they will. And they do. Life, real and intense, shifted to down there in limited pools of light, in air smoky from kerosene lamps and candle wax. The templates drew them like magnets. There's much to be said about this seance, but we don't have time. The women of the convent have been struggling constantly to reclaim different things, their own sense of their own bodies, their imaginative as opposed to the merely physical control of their maternal instincts, their sexuality, as well as their ambiguous spirituality, and altogether their memory and understanding of womanhood and of love. The seance represents the melding together of all their hopes, fears, and vague ideas as oppressed women, such that in that shared space, they re-emerge stronger in the bonds of spiritual co-creation. And Consolata is the supreme agent of this co-creation, even though she herself has struggled with a complete lack of empathy and comprehension from the women about her own state of emotional pain and anguish. We may pause to draw a productive analogy between Morrison's Consolata and Aeschylus' Cassandra in Agamemnon, as well as with Io in Prometheus Bound. For all three female characters have the distinction of having or possessing prophetic insight that is inextricably coupled to their existential status as anchorites in a sea of incomprehension from those around them. Prometheus Bound is especially appropriate for this analogy, especially when we read the play backwards, that is to say, from Io's perspective, as opposed to from Prometheus' perspective, which is of course the dominant one in the play. In reading Aeschylus' play through Io's perspective, we also have to pay attention to the female choric Oceanids as a group of ritual lamenters. Such a reading also allows us to establish the distinction between the sense of unmooring provided by Io's spatial itinerary, as described in the play, and that of the solidity and epic grounding indicated by Prometheus' central physical location. The dynamic relationship between stasis and mobility is one that organizes different levels of the play, but which can be destabilized if we privilege mobility, that's to say, Io's itinerant perspective, above that of Prometheus' epic immobility. Once this is done, a fresh set of issues is opened up by which to look at the play and the novel together. For example, how might we contrast the lament of the Oceanids to the dreaming of the convent women? And if the convent women do lament, what is the nature of their lamentation? What is the vehicle? How does the vehicle of their lamentation alter the meaning of the lamentation? Furthermore, how do we compare Consolata and Io, both women afflicted by a sense of loss and of the impact upon their consciousness of an inarticulable tragic sensibility? And how about the sexual, divine, and spiritual economy of the two texts, and how these produce a sense of extreme isolation for Io on the one hand, and of a fractious non-identity for Consolata? And so we come to Baby Suggs. Before moving on to discuss the character of Baby Suggs in Beloved, I want to draw attention to the different modalities of spatial traversal we find in the novel, and the ways in which they're encoded at different levels or scales. The novel offers us two scales of spatial traversal. The one at the foreground, the one at the foreground of the narration is that of the escape from Sweet Home Farm in Kentucky to the freed slave community of Cincinnati. So that's, when I say foreground, it means that it is represented in a variety of ways as the novel unfolds. This level of spatial traversal is explored in detail, but is also encoded in the mind of Sethi and Paul D as a series of geographical eruptions that come to fall under the rubric of remembering, especially for Sethi. Unlike remembering, and my students and I track the differences between remembering and remembering in Beloved. Unlike remembering is about radical breaches to the commonplaces of thought and affect. And for Sethi, these breaches emerge in her mind as specific spatial correlatives, so that remembering, as she tells her daughter, is not like a deja vu, but is a place you may not have experienced in the past, but that nevertheless waits in ambush for your arrival. The second scale of spatial traversal in the novel is that demarcated by the Black Atlantic, slavery, and is encoded in the novel first in the character of Beloved, and then as part of the backdrop of volatile proximity to slavery in the minds of individual characters. As we know from the poetic middle sections of the novel, Beloved, as well as being Sethi's daughter, whose throat was cut by her mother 18 years previously, is also representative of the 6 million and more who traversed the Black Atlantic during the slave trade. But these encodings also mean that Beloved is both a figure of fictive immanence, as She is the articulation of the tragic logic of American plantation slavery, and more problematically, as the transcendental signifier of a condition that can never be properly grasped by history itself. So she's immanent because she's part of the tragic family saga, but she's also transcendental because she stands in for the 6 billion and more. But that standing in is never properly integrated into the novel. And that is the significance of the fragmented poetic sections. This duality then renders the principle of spatial traversal and its significance highly elusive in the novel, both from the perspective of the characters and from our own perspective as readers. It represents a hermeneutic impasse of the most intractable kind. The novel delivers all the horrifying details of slavery and its aftermath, of lynchings, whippings, and slavery capture piecemeal. And no matter how horrifying these are, it does not allow us to lose our focus on the emotional challenges that the characters face in reconstructing their lives. The system of slavery places sadness at the center of their lives, the desolated center, as Morrison tells us in her description of Baby Suggs, where her real self was no self, made its home. This description may extend to all the survivors of slavery that we are introduced to in the novel, for the desolation at their core is tied to a no less momentous question, namely, what does freedom mean to persons previously unfree, whose entire world was crafted with them as objects to be dehumanized, bought, whipped, sold, captured, whipped, and sold again? The timeline of the novel is 1856 to 1874. That's when all the events take place. But there is an interposition between 1856 and 1874, in which is the Emancipation Act, which is 1865. So by 1874, which is where most of the events take place, they have barely been 10 years away from slavery. So that the question of what is an ex-slave to do with their freedom under the shadow, and it is a real shadow because some states are still battling against the principle of emancipation. So this is the key question. We are told more than once in the course of the novel that to be free is one thing, but what to do with that freedom is the real question. And each character provides a different answer to it. For Baby Suggs, the initial challenge is to learn how to love each part of one's body slowly and individually, and to teach others how to do the same. As she puts it to the people that gather weekly to hear her secular sermons and the clearing, and if we have time, I would like to read her sermon at the end, but this is just a little bit of it. Here in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder, they flee. And oh my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them. Raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face because they don't love that either. You got to love it. You. And her sermons in the clearing follow a specific itinerary. First, she calls Yeah, this is what we see here. First, she calls the children to her and asks them to laugh. Then she calls the grown men and asks them to dance. And finally, she calls the women and asks them to cry. Just cry. It starts that way, but after a while, children start dancing, women start laughing, and men start crying, until everything gets mixed up. And completely exhausted, they lie down in the clearing, all as one. It is only after these invitations to experiential embodiment, because that's the thing, that you have to inhabit the body as an experience. That's why she says dance, laugh, cry. It is only after these invitations to experiential embodiment that she delivers her sermon. She does not tell them that they shall inherit the earth, or that they should go and sin no more, but that the only grace they deserve is what they can imagine. If they can't imagine it, they don't deserve it. In her sermon, Baby Suggs is getting them all to reassemble their bodies as a bulwark against their prior commodification as slaves, where their every single part served a purpose completely contrary to their own well-being. It is a resignification of the body post-slavery through the supreme and intentional act of self-love, the highest form of love available to them in their condition of liminal freedom. And yet it turns out that how to claim the body after bondage is not so straightforward after all, because entailed in that claiming of the self is also the social and familiar relationships that one has to undertake with others. As Sethi shows us, the claim that she makes of her own self the non-negotiable claim that she makes of her own self extends to cover her own children, such that in her mind, she comes to hold the power not only of salvation, but also of life and death over them. Rather than give us an extended ethnography of or history of slave life, Toni Morrison places at the center of Beloved an event that acts as the emotional vortex for both the characters within the novel and us as readers. When Sethi kills her crawling already daughter, the terrible act is witnessed by 4 people, namely the school teacher, who has come to capture them and take them back to Kentucky, the town's sheriff that has been invited to come and help arrest the escapee slave, Stump Pay, a handyman and friend of the family, and Baby Suggs. All the male characters, including later Paul D, when he's shown the drawing that was made of Sethi in the town's newspaper after her arrest. Paul D is a lover who reappears from the slave period. Including Paul D, after he's shown the drawing that was made of Sethi in the town's newspaper after her arrest, passed negative judgment on her choice. It is only Baby Suggs who truly recognizes the total impossibility of moral judgment. So profound is this recognition that it destroys her big heart, undermines her faith, and makes her retreat to her bed to contemplate colors. Baby Suggs' recognition of the undesirability of ethical choice may be interpreted in terms of Aristotle's category of, now I'm showing my Aristotelian credentials, in terms of Aristotle's category of anagnorisis or recognition. But in this instance, it is enacted through the discursive displacement of what should strictly have been Sethi's own anagnorisis and not Baby Suggs'. To recall very briefly Aristotle's discussion of tragedy, the central components of a tragic action are plot, which he calls repeatedly the soul of tragedy, the coincidence of anagnorisis or recognition / knowledge with peripeteia, a reversal of fortunes. So Aristotle says that complex plot induces a coincidence between the moment of recognition and reversal. The tragic character is the subject of a hamartia, or error of judgment, and the whole composition produces a sense of pity and fear and of catharsis that helps to purge the viewer of the emotional perturbation brought on by the tragic action. As a general rule, and all commentators on Aristotle take this proposition for granted, as a general rule, the anagnorisis or recognition or knowledge is experienced by the tragic characters themselves. And normally, when it is too late to do anything with the knowledge that they have acquired. Thus, for example, best example, a lot of examples, one that comes to mind very easily. Thus, for example, in Shakespeare's Othello, the eponymous character realizes much too late that he has been mightily fooled by Iago. But too late, because when that recognition arrives, he has already killed his wife. When Othello says, before you go, wait a moment, write of me as I am, nothing extenuate. What he's really telling them is that ignore the evidence of your senses, i.e., that I've just strangled my wife. That's what he's saying. He says, write of me as I am, nothing. That speech is really fast because he says, do not. So he's going counter to his insistent request for proof, ocular proof. Because he says, I want evidence that my wife has cheated on me, and Iago complies with the handkerchief trick. But now he's telling them that ignore the evidence of your senses, that is to say, that I've strangled my wife. And then he launches into a long explanation, after which he kills himself. The point, however, which I want to note is that his agnorisis arrives too late. In Beloved, the transposition of agnorisis from the central character, that is Sethi, to one who is only a witness bearer to the tragic choice, is at the heart of the moral conundrum that afflicts Baby Suggs. For she has to contend with it, with this affliction, because unlike the other characters who also bear witness to the terrible act, she is, like Sethi, also a mother produced by the system of slavery, and is thus the only one who is really able to empathize with the younger woman while also refusing to endorse her act itself. So the anagnorisis, because Sethi refuses to admit that she's made a mistake. The one who recognizes that something major has happened is the witness bearer. So the anagnorisis is separated from Sethi, who undertakes the tragic act, and is invested in the consciousness of Baby Suggs. The simultaneous expression and atrophying of maternal instincts that are placed on view by Sethi's choice are what split Baby Suggs both ways and what fatally break a big heart. What Baby Suggs witnesses induces a deep existential crisis that she is never able to recover from for the rest of the novel. Her entire world is discombobulated, and she suffers, she comes to suffer a form of biographical and emotional discontinuity, even though she's not the one that exercises the tragic choice in the first place. What I have to do, she tells Stampede. What I have to do, she tells Stampede, as he tries to encourage her to go back to the clearing, is get in my bed and lay down. I want to fix on something harmless in this world. The conversation continues. What world are you talking about? Ain't nothing harmless down here. Yes, it is. Blue. That don't hurt nobody. Yellow neither. You getting in bed to think about yellow? I like yellow. Then what? When you get through with blue and yellow, then what? Can't say. It's something can't be planned. Now, this retreat to contemplate yellow I analogize it with William Blake's Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hands or eye there frame the fearful symmetry. That contradiction that Blake tried. Why the same? Was it the same God that made the tiger, made the lamb? In her case, though, she wants to retreat to find something prior to let there be light. You know, it's almost like the fundaments of creation. Color must have been somewhere in there. And color is pre-judgmental. It's before it is incorporated into the domains of judgment of men and women. So her attempt is similar to, is as profound as William Blake's Tiger poem, because it's trying to find a source of creation which is pre-discursive. So she's adopting color, the examination, exploration of color as pre-discursive. And throughout the novel, especially when she's still alive, she calls for, so she's in bed and she calls for different colors. And sometimes there's not enough color. So when she asks for pink, Seti has to stick out her tongue to show her, I want pink. For someone whose entire life has been spent healing others, as a grand spiritual shaman, and giving of her mighty heart, this retreat to color is an extremely painful process. But the point is that for Baby Sharks, neither judgment nor catharsis is available to her. She recognizes that Seti's act is both necessary and repugnant, both fated and willed, a gesture of freedom and a distraction at one and the same time. It is not at all clear to me whether the splintering and transfer of anagnorisis from the tragic protagonist to one that bears witness to the tragic act is to be found in other tragedies. And believe me, I have looked. But Morrison definitely gives us means for reviewing this idea of the firm link between anagnorisis and the tragic hero or heroine. The lesson expressed in the characters of Consolata and Baby Suggs is that because the self is subject to contradictory emotional impulses and is also actively interacting with a morally unstable world, it is faced with a series of ethical conundrums that have no clear resolution. Thus, every choice and every decision has to be taken in full and active cognizance of its alternatives. These conundrums seem to cripple action, and for some have to be disavowed. But I think the point that Morrison gives us is similar to the one encapsulated by Chinua Achebe in his novel Arrow of God. The world is like a mask dancing. You cannot see it properly by standing still. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting, and I really enjoyed the talk. And I wanted to ask you, I wrote it down, and I'm going to get it right. So, what do you think Morrison's literary experiments on spatial traversal tell us about how our own pre-reflective habits of attention might be reconfigured in our own journey through lived space, especially with regard to the negotiation between the public and private spheres in the life world?
Okay, I think you've asked like 6 questions in one, but I'm going to answer what I think are 2 of them. First of all, to really understand the consequences of spatial traversal requires a mode of attention and intentionality. You know, you see these days, actually older people also, younger people crossing the street with cars coming, looking at their phone. I see it all the time driving into campus at Stanford. And these kids are riding these scooters. And they are looking at their phones. This is anathema. And it's not only is it dangerous, they are also not paying attention to the environments they are traversing. And this extends to other things, traveling with your parents and friends, where the interaction with the pixelated others on the screen is more important than the interactions with human others. And I think this is a consequence of, so technology has enabled many things, but it has also trapped us. So this is a form of, I think, sad entrapment of our attention, technology. And I think Morrison will have, I'm sure she did have a view on this. In terms of the difference between the private attention and the difference between private and public, now there is a degree to which the private sphere, the sphere of familiarity, of family and familiarity, can be as obfuscating as the public sphere. There are all kinds of hierarchical power plays, bullying, the undermining of self. I mean, how many people are not undermined in their confidence and self-worth by their parents or siblings and so on and so forth? So it would be a mistake to think that the familial space is somehow necessarily more nurturing, or it's in a binary opposition with the agora, the public sphere, which is of course full of, riven with crocodiles and so on. It would be a mistake. Rather, we have to understand them both dialectically, in the sense that the sphere of banal family life can be either invigorating or utterly destructive. Why are psychoanalysts making so much money from us? It's because of the fundamental dysfunctionalism of the family. So the private sphere is not necessarily, so my answer is that the two have to be understood dialectically and in cautious detailing of what is affirming and what is discombobulating in either one of them. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the mic for accessibility. And that kind of gets into my question. And thinking in terms of Morrison, we could also think of Octavia Butler, Hurston, a lot of folks in terms of thinking about disability, sort of in the Black imagination and a lot of this literature. And I'm thinking particularly Sulu, of thinking of like, what does the Black disabled body look like, especially in kind of terms of what you're thinking about in terms of this kind of shamanism, and in many ways, if we look at Butler, the ways in which kind of disability then becomes a transcendent quality. Just some reflections there of kind of what do you see between those, and even the quote in front of us, right? By standing still for the disabled body, like how are we able to dance, thinking about different ways in which the body moves, especially also this conference thinking about trauma and the ways of mental illness. These things are manifested in Morrison's work, but maybe just some thoughts there.
I happen to, among other things, have written a book on disability. So I am very, and what she does is in her novels, most, if not all of them, in almost every novel, she gives us an example of a disabled character, whether it's Sula or the Bluest Eye, and it's different kinds of disability. Some are, cognitive, cognitive madness and so on. Some are motor impairments, like EWPC in Sula and so on. However, her disabled characters are not necessarily powerless. I mean, the most powerful, one of the most powerful characters is EWPC, who has her leg, she voluntarily surrenders her leg to be chopped off by a train so that she can collect the insurance money and look after her kids. So her characters are not necessarily disabled, because there's a difference between impairment and disability. Disability is a social product. It's a product. So if you had a mobility impairment and there was no ramp to climb into this place, your impairment will be converted into a disability. So her characters have impairments, but they are not necessarily disabled. I mean, in a way, I'm generalizing because there's at least, as I'm still talking, recalling one character, Violet in Jazz. Her cognitive disorder is not so much disabling, but it is bewildering to those around her. So they're bewildered by her, and that novel also institutes the difference between the disabled person's own self-awareness and what others see them as doing or performing. So in that novel, there's this uncanny split between how people perceive Violet and how Violet perceives herself. But actually, you could write a whole, book just on Toni Morrison and disability. I just finished teaching a graduate class on not all of the novels, but a substantial number of them, and I'm trying to scan in my mind. And yeah, disabled characters appear in almost every single one of them, either in marginal roles or dominant roles. EWPC is dominant, Violet is dominant, and Baby Suggs has a hip injury, so she's described as walking like a three-legged dog. So she limps really badly. And in the section where she's preaching, her limp is focused upon also as part of the messaging around reassembling the body. Is because she herself knows what it is for your body to be impaired. So her three-legged limp is referenced. So thank you for the question.
Can I answer?
Yes.
I am all new to Toni Morrison, and it's really thanks to Otto that I even started to actually read and not, the novel and not about her. What do you do in Paradise about the two communities? So the all black and then the one in the convent that, where we just don't know. I mean, are they multiracial, whatever? Why did Morrison want to have these two communities?
Well, I deliberately suppressed much attention to the community of Ruby because it's a different kind of entity. However, Ruby is a kind of exodus, biblical exodus community. They escape different forms of oppression and racism in different parts of America, and they all congregate, and the description of their spatial traverse of their journey is very exodus-like. It's described in great detail, and the almost magical realist signs and tokens that they receive as they are traversing the space, and even where they finally settle, and so on. It's very biblical in the way it's done. However, once they settle, they want to establish a community of complete equality. However, with time, so they are all equal in this community. However, with time, certain fissures and cracks appear in the community for a variety of reasons. One is that it is inherently patriarchal. So the women in the community begin to feel restless at the kind of objections to certain things that they might do as women. But the other thing is that the community is also built on colorism. By the way, colorism is a big motif in Toni Morrison's novels. Toni Morrison doesn't, and she has said this in various interviews, she doesn't write with respect to the white gaze or the white man. However, in every novel, there is a character who performs whiteness, but who is black. Yeah, and they are a mixed race, high yellow. There are different descriptions of them, and they have a very haughty and self-privileged attitude. Cutting to Ruby. In Ruby, one source of friction is that there's a hierarchy between what they call the 8 rock family, or families. That's the founding families. And the founding families are black. They have no quote-unquote mixture among them.
And this 8 rock family then establishes a hierarchy of privilege, which then with time begins to rankle. So the non-8 rock, non-quite, non-fully, or mixed race and so on. It's almost like the 8 rock family are trying to extricate themselves from the history of sexual violence that constitutes American slavery. Because American slavery was... So the 8 rock ideology is an ideology that tries to artificially separate themselves from this fundamental history of sexual violence. Anyway, there are many other contrasts. The convent is all women. It seems to be completely disorderly. Unlike the Ruby, there are roads, there are times of day, there are churches and so on. The convent is unruly women. But the women are more authentic in the sense that they express their feelings and emotions in a much more authentic. There's no subterfuge or hypocrisy or opportunity. And that's why when they are fighting, they fight in the raw. There's no innuendo. They don't practice. There's no innuendo in the convent. Now, this difference is really important because the convent also shows the moral bankruptcy of this national idea, because the Ruby is also an objective correlative of nationalist ideology, of nationalist thinking. So it's just so happens that they're all black, but it's actually the logic of it is a nationalist logic. It's an ethno-nationalism, a form of ethno-nationalism. So the novel also incorporates a critique of forms of ethno-nationalism, even though it's a black community. There's more to be said, but...
Thank you for your talk. My question, and I'm glad you talked about the role of women in the novels, because in your talk, you centrally highlight women, right, as a kind of a way of thinking about questions of the ethnography of the private sphere, the challenges to self-creation. And as you state, women are, written about within this realm of domesticity, right? Within that level of the home, right? Within this, and that spatial traversals, right, seem to occur, right, within the context of home. But while also not leaving home, so to speak, right? So I wanted to know about, the role of women in this concept of home and the spatial traversals, given the fact that, one can be homebound in the confining sense, right, in the context of patriarchy for women. But then on the other hand, there's a kind of boundedness towards something, right? We're homebound, right, to a certain level, right, of boundedness with the spatial traversal, themes that you're raising here. And that this, to a certain extent, leads you to a shamanic creation, right, in which the home then starts to extend into this shamanic self-creation, right, that the role of women starts to play in. And so I wonder, as I start thinking about this question, is this similar to a kind of like second sight, or within the African American tradition, and this is Toni Morrison's take on the prophetic tradition, in African American thought, as a kind of second sight that is grounded within the experiences of women, bounded in home and bounded to a home, so to speak.
Well, thanks for the question. In much literature, it's assumed that men are the ones that make things happen. And by make things happen, it's not just they launch wars. As we know in the world today, men have launched ridiculous wars. It's not that they launch wars, but that in the narrative progression, the difference between an incident and an event. An event is one that has consequences for the motto of the plot. So the plot will go in a certain direction because an event leads it in one way or the other. Typically, it's men who orchestrate events. and women are reserved for incidents. The other thing is that in much of literature, it is men, and here this is an Aristotelian principle, it is for men, or it is men who exercise ethically salient choices or ethically consequential choices. But an ethical consequential choice cannot be consequential unless there is contradiction. You know, if someone asks you, or you go somewhere and they ask you, do you want coffee or do you want coffee? That's not really a choice. There's no need. And even if they asked you, do you want coffee or do you want tea? Whether you want coffee or tea has no ethical consequence. For Aristotle, the choice has to have an ethical, there should be consequential in some way. What Toni Morrison shows us is that women at home, homebound, are constantly having to make ethically consequential choices. It is the principle of ethical consequence, of choices in the face of uncertainty. I think this is the key point, that the choice has to be made in the face of uncertainty and even in the face of ignorance. Because the choice is consequential because you don't have all the pieces of information necessary for making that choice. So what she does is that she actually converts the domain of the private, of domesticity, into the domain of heroic action. Heroic action not being the launching of wars, but the making of ethically consequential choices. So this is how I see that actually what she has done is that she converted the private sphere, the domain of the domesticity, into the domain of epicity, or the epic. So take, for example, Seti. Her decision to kill her daughter, some people will say it makes absolutely no sense. And that's what all the men think. But by doing that, she has elevated, and this is what I'm going to say has been written about or commented upon. She elevates Seti to the status of Medea. The difference between Medea and Seti, though, is that Medea, in EWPC's play, actually reflects upon publicly her decision to kill her sons. In fact, the chorus of men tried to dissuade her, and she says it takes like 200 to 300 lines before she finally settles on the decision. In other words, her decision to kill her sons is deliberative. She takes her time. In the case of Seti, she has no time to think. She just sees the hearts of the four men, white men, on the horses, and she knows that they're coming for her. And in that split second, we don't know the processes of thought. She just gathers her children, attempts to kill the others, and then kills the... Now, this is the domain of epic choice making, because she hasn't had time to do what the other observers have had time to. Why did you do it? Why didn't you wait? She couldn't have done that. So I think that by generating this ethical choice making and transfer, and these are profound choices that do not settle into any clear meaning immediately. By doing this, she transfers the principle of epic heroism to the domestic sphere. I think that's what she has done. So actually, her women are all heroic in the old Greek sense, except that they don't beat anybody up. The Greeks, yeah.
I was just wondering whether it is possible, in your opinion, to read literature, and especially Toni Morrison's literature, as a way of healing. Because there are so many traumas that you mentioned, like transgenerational trauma of slavery, or domestic violence, or bodily traumas. So is it possible to read it as a way of healing, a way of empowerment, maybe, or...
Well, I wish I could. In medical humanities, in the medical humanities, they try to answer this specific question. So, for example, Sophocles' Philoctetes, which I also teach, is a core text in medical humanity. Basically, Philoctetes is a soldier, Greek soldier, who has been abandoned for 10 years on the island of Lemnos and by the Greek army, and he has a pus-filled foot, so he walks very painfully. And so anyway, so they use that to. But the point in the medical humanities is to get doctors, physicians, not to think that their sole objective is to cure pain. Because the pain represents an epistemological crisis for doctors. When you go and you say, my head is hurting me, they give you a painkiller. And if you go back and you say, my head is still hurting me, you've presented them with a problem. So the point of reading Philoctetes is for them to be oriented to the totality of the person. So it's not just your head that is aching you. If you went to a shaman in Africa, they will ask you, whom have you quarreled with in the last 6 months? Your social relations are broken. That's why your head is hurting. So they will tell you, go back and apologize to that person, and then come back and I'll give you, Advil. They will not give you the Advil first. And the point of it is to treat the person holistically. So I think that's the purpose of using or offering texts such as Philoctetes to the medical humanities. When we come to Toni Morrison, her novels are so complex that I think it would be dangerous to offer a single meaning. I think what her novels do, and I've seen it many times, it makes you want to cry. The novels have a congregational quality. Pilate, there's a section where Pilate's granddaughter has died, and she's laid out in the church. And Pilate comes into the church imperiously, and she goes around the pews, and she fixes her glance at each individual, and then tells them, and she was loved. And then she moved here, and she was loved. And she moves there, and the whole scene is so beautifully, you want to, the sense of mourning and affirmation, it makes you want to weep. There are many scenes in Morrison life. So the only thing I can say, weeping is not a bad thing, because it also washes away the incrustations of wrong judgment or wrong feeling. And who knows, that might correct minimally or maybe profoundly the ways in which they see the world. But the direct, I wish I could say so, that you know what, you are quarreling with your husband, read Beloved and everything will be solved. I wish I could say that. Or read a Song of Solomon and all shall be well. I wish, because if I did that, I probably would not be teaching at the university. I would do something else. But I can't say that. The only thing I can say that it wells you, her novels well you up with sorrow. They well you up with sorrow, but the point of the sorrowfulness is to generate an empathy. An empathy that's also connected to different structures of ideation.
At the end, or towards the end, maybe one question that connects Hawaii and the African American community. There were about 60 newspapers in the 19th century in Hawaii during the monarchy that were printed in native Hawaiian language. And I understand that when Morrison was doing her research, she was going through tons of newspapers that were printed by Black Americans.
Yes.
So what happened to that literature? The native Hawaiian newspapers vanished. And it's only now that Native Hawaiians are recovering all that wealth of information. So is Toni Morrison one of the few who looks at that?
No. There's a whole tradition of Black publishing, writing, and so. She herself has a collection called the Black Book. The Black Book is newspaper cuttings. So for example, the story from which she took the story of Beloved is a real historical event. Margaret Garner, who was escaping in Kentucky, the story is similar. And before she was arrested, she killed her child. So it's in that book. So there is, and she's not the only one. There's lots of people researching this area and so on and so forth. And it's a tradition that is not as alive, I think, as it was in the 19th century. It's not alive, but there's a whole archive. In fact, I went to a talk in the digital humanities where someone, I know she's moving to Northwestern University, where she was describing the Black Archive, work on digitizing the Black Archive, and what you might do. So there is a lot of much of it.
Well, it looks like you inspired us and you overwhelmed us with plenty of new stories and new figures. Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you so much.